This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello and welcome to Chthonia Podcast. I'm your host, Breach Burke. This week we are going to be continuing our series on the Navadurgas, who are the 9 manifestations of Durga, Parvati, of the great Devi, shall we say, at the, usually at the Navaratri festival, which takes place, actually Navaratri, at the time of recording this, Navaratri has just ended. We've just come to Diwali, and this is the, but each particular day of the 9 days of Navaratri, Nava being 9, there's a different form of the Devi that is worshipped. And this Devi is usually, these forms of Durga are as the goddess Parvati, okay? Because Parvati is really, as we had mentioned in the last podcast, and I'm not going to repeat that whole story, but she's an embodiment of Sati or Shakti, okay? And Shakti, of course, being the spouse of Shiva. Now, Shiva is interesting kind of a figure in and of himself. His original form was probably more the form of the god Rudra, and so he tends to be very ferocious form and also very destructive. But Shiva has always been kind of a loner. He doesn't, dress, doesn't dress in nice clothes. He wears usually sort of a tiger skin, and he lives out in the woods. He has matted hair. He's got long dreadlocks. Usually coiled with serpents, and he is, and he's usually, covered in mud and filth. I mean, he's out in the wild is where he is, and he is an ascetic. He's, so he lives that, at least certainly in the Vedic version, we see Shiva as somebody who is kind of this lone wolf, as it will. He's this force for destruction that hides out in the wilds, okay? And it makes sense because if Shiva represents this kind of more uncivilized force, then, the idea of Shiva as living out in, being a wild man, as it were, in the same way that you will see with people who follow certain, like the Agori, for example, who follow certain paths, who hang out in the cremation grounds, who are covered in ash and who, violate all sorts of taboos, and they, that you see that kind of, you've got Shiva definitely has a connection to Tantra. When you practice Tantra definitely is very much connected in with Shaivism, worship of Shiva. However, what's interesting about this particular version is this paints a Shiva who is a more, perhaps more orthodox, okay, more Vedic in his way and in his inflection. And we're going to talk a little bit about that and what, some of the paradoxes that we see there. So first, let's talk about this second Navadurga, who is called Brahmacharini. Now, Brahmacharini is also a word that is used for a female renunciate. So when you have women who move to the ashram to renounce the world, okay, go live under with a guru, they often take vows as Brahmacharinis. Okay, so before they take vows as Swaminis, they're Brahmacharinis. That's sort of the initial or the beginning stage, or the first vows that they would take. And the goddess Brahmacharini or Brahmacharini Devi, she appears with she wears white clothes. She holds a japa mala, which is basically a rudraksha mala, in her right hand, and those are those rudraksha beads. They're very commonly seen. They're the brown ones that look kind of, like little point balls, little pointy balls. Like the little. I'm not sure I'm coming up with the right word here, but they're rough. They're rough in texture, and they look like they're basically rudrakshas are like a dried seed. They're called Shiva's tears, is what they're called. So they're usually they're strung in a mala of about 108, so that you can perform japa, which is where you recite your mantra and you count off. You use the beads to count off because usually mantras are recited in batteries of about 108 repetitions, sometimes 1,000, but usually 108. And usually a mala will have, what you'll have beads on either side, and you have about half that. You have about 54 beads on a mala. And then there'll be one larger seed, one larger Rudraksha bead at the bottom. And that is because normally you do japa with your eyes closed. So as you run through and you're basically counting with the seeds. And as soon as you hit that big, larger seed, you feel that in your hand, then you know you're about halfway. And then when you hit it again, you know that you're done. So it's kind of a tool for you to be able to meditate and focus on your mantra without having to sit up there and focus on counting. Okay. So that's what a japa mala is. And then she has a kamandala in her left hand, which is a water pot. And as we'll see, that figures into her legend. Now, we mentioned with Shailaputri, who is the daughter of the mountains, daughter of the Himalayas, last time, that, she is, she is young Parvati. Okay, Parvati is this reincarnation of Sati or Shakti. So Brahmacharini is this form of Parvati. It's kind of as a young virginal girl before she's married, okay, where she's in her womanhood. So she's at a point where she's ready to be married. So she's not a child, but she's also not at a point of actually being the wife of Shiva. So here's just the legend. This is just kind of the summary of the legend. I'm actually taking versions of it from a few different places on the internet, mostly sites from India, also a little bit from Wikipedia. So this is sort of the summary version. Now, according to this legend, different versions of the story, Maiden Parvati resolves to marry Shiva. Her parents learn of her desire and try to discourage her. Now, this is very similar to when she was, in her form as Sati. They also did not want her to marry Shiva. But she's determined, and it is one of the sages, actually, who tells her, Sage Narada, who actually advises her that this is the way to attain Shiva, is to perform these austerities, as they call them, or tapas. So she decides she's going to perform this penance for about 5,000 years. So now, in the meantime, there is an Ashura called Tarkashur, who was, and like a lot of the Ashuras, or they use the word demon, but, as we know, demon means something different in in what we think of as quote unquote Eastern religion, versus what we think of a demon in, monotheistic European American religion. Okay. So, usually demons, and like I said, demons can attain boons because demons also can perform tapas. They can perform austerities. They can do things to get the attention of the gods, to make the gods pleased. Doing things that are pleasing, particularly to Brahma, and to Shiva as well. And then they could be granted a boon. Okay. And the boons are sometimes very bizarre. In this case, Tarkasur has attained the boon of only being able to be killed by the son of Shiva. So they're thinking, okay, Shiva has to get married. He has to produce this son so we can get rid of this Ashura, because he's now, usually at the point that they're, looking for a remedy or looking to find, the weak spot of this particular Ashura, usually the Ashura is now causing trouble. Trying to dominate, taking possession, might be killing, its own ambition begins to become out of hand. So what happens is that Shiva, what they do is they engage Kamadeva, okay? And Lord Kama he's very much like the Eros or Cupid that we see in the Western, in Greek mythology and in Roman mythology, okay? Who takes his arrows, bow and arrow, and he fires it, right? And when that arrow hits, the person who's been hit, the first person that they see, usually in these stories, it's somebody of the opposite sex, okay? They fall in love with that person, okay? This is how Eros and Psyche come together, because Eros is supposed to be wounding her, and instead he accidentally wounds himself, and falls in love. So you see this happening, and this is how Hades and Persephone get together. He shoots his arrow at Hades. He sees Persephone and says, "Oh yeah, gotta have that." So this is the way that this operates. However, when Kama decides to point his arrow at Shiva and hits him, Shiva opens his third eye and burns Kama to ash. Okay, so Kamadeva is so desire is removed from the world in this way. So it was not a good strategy, and there is a kind of metaphor, or at least it's something to be thought about in the story about the fact that through ordinary lust and desire, Shiva is not attainable. Okay, that's kind of the message there. That was not trying to appeal to his lust was not going to work. And eventually, I should note that Sri Lalita Devi eventually is the one who puts, who brings Kama back to life and brings Kama back into the world. But in any case, for now, this doesn't work. But Parvati, even though she's a little bit, dismayed by this, she also doesn't give up. So she continues her asceticism. She engages in the same activities as him. She goes off to the forest. She engages in yogini practices and tapas, and this is what makes her known as the goddess Brahmacharini. And now, of course, the fact that she is going through all of this self-denial arouses Shiva's interest. Okay, but he's still not really willing to get involved with her. But he goes to her in disguise and tries to tell her, oh, you should not be interested in Shiva, and talks about all of his personality problems and weaknesses. But she's unmoved. She just says, no, you're not going to dissuade me. Okay. Now, during this time, there's another Ashura who comes along called Prakandashura, Prakandashura, and he attacks Parvati and along with 1 million other Ashuras. Okay, he attacks goddess Parvati. So, this ends up being, she's unable, because of the tapas that she's performing, she can't fight against him. And so Lakshmi and Saraswati come and they intervene and they try to fight them, but they're outnumbered. But what ends up happening is that her water pot, her kamandalu, is pushed over. Okay, and when it is, because at this point she's not, she was only eating these, what do they call them? Bilva leaves. This is all she was eating and drinking water. That was her only food for this time. And at this point, she's only drinking water. But her water pot that's next to her gets knocked over, and this ends up drowning the demons. Okay? And again, that's the little detail to note in terms of trying to interpret this. So at that point, she's able to open her eyes, and she emits fire from her eyes, and she burns Prakandashura to ashes. So now everyone's impressed by this, except Shiva, of course. So, so he comes back to her again in the disguise of a Brahmachari, which is a male, renunciate devotee. And so he starts to ask her questions, starts, addressing her with riddles, which every single one of them she answers and answers correctly. So finally he praises her not only for her beauty, but also for her, the fact that she's intelligent, all right? And at that point, he makes a marriage proposal, and once she realizes she's dealing with Shiva, she accepts it. Okay. And so at this point, she breaks her tapas. So she takes on another form after this. But this is the basic story of her form as goddess Brahmacharini. And we think about that 5,000 years, we're like, yeah, it's an awfully long time to be a young person. But of course, if you're a deity and you're technically immortal, or at least you naturally... unless there's some kind of a, something that interferes. Parvati, of course, is, she's going to be, reincarnated because she is that fundamental embodiment of that fundamental Shakti or that consciousness of the universe. So, Parvati, 5,000 years is not really a whole lot of time. So she's, so she is, okay, so she's this representation of the Svadhisthana chakra, which is also known as the sacral chakra. It's the one directly above the root or the Muladhara. It's the one that's in the place of where you would have for a woman where, the uterus would be. That is the sacral or the sacrum. And so, and she's, and they were saying that the fact that she's a Brahmacharini signifies that she's unmarried, and then the color white signifies purity. Now, one thing we also know about the color white in, at least in Hindu thinking, is that it's also the color of death. It's also the color. It's not only the color worn here by a virgin, but also by widows. Widows also tend to wear white. So, although in this case it is meant to detail someone who is a renunciate. So, what do we need to look at in this story? So, what are the interesting features of this story? Okay, well, the first one we talked about, which is the idea that Shiva cannot be attained. You can't through normal mechanisms of, falling in love or falling in lust or being, tantalized by beauty or whatever. You're not going to win Shiva over. Shiva requires a lot more. Remembering, of course, if we think about the fact that Sati or Shakti was his first wife, and Parvati is that reincarnation, he obviously doesn't seem to see that she's the reincarnation of Sati, at least not at that point. But, but Sati was, this is the standard by which he judges other women. Let's put it that way. So he's not going to, it's going to be fair. The woman who he marries has to be fairly extraordinary. And honestly, as it's weird, you start to see some of these interesting paradoxes, because Shiva is the destroyer, but when in his relationship with Shakti, he's also the creator. And as we pointed out in the last one, Shiva without Shakti is Shava. He's just a corpse. He really isn't anything without her. The story of the 10 Mahavidyas demonstrates that to some degree. I mean, I'm not going to get into that one. That's a whole separate topic. But the 10 Mahavidya, those are the 10 forms of Sati or Parvati. And she is, and that embodiment of that feminine that Shiva also recognizes at the end is part of himself. Okay. So what else can we say about Brahmacharini? There's just looking at some of these other elements about her, and they were talking about she had the Rajaksha, and then her the pot that she carries that's the only water that she had during her final years of penance. And it was saying, okay, there's interesting detail here. Her tapas went on for thousands of years. Severe weather conditions like scorching summers, harsh winters, and stormy rains did not shake her resolve. She survived 1,000 years on a diet of flour and fruits, another 100 years on leafy vegetables, and 3,000 years on bilva leaves while sleeping on the floor. Later, she stopped eating bilva leaves and continued her penance without food and water. Seeing her in resolve, Lord Brahma gave her a blessing, and she became Lord Shiva's consort. Okay, so this is another version. Now, it's interesting, in this particular version, it ends up being overlapped with the original Sati story, talking about her immolating herself after her husband is insulted. But, that's actually going back to the Sati story. I feel like that's kind of, that may actually be, I mean, I don't know. There could be variations where the same story repeats itself, but I think that's actually a reworking of the original story. Now, it says that Brahmacharini governs Lord Mangal, who is associated with Mars and the provider of all fortunes. I mean, you will talk about the Mangalam, okay? That is the, so she's attached to the providing of all fortune, and there's lotuses attached to her body that symbolize knowledge, and the white sari representing purity, right? By worshipping her, virtues such as penance, renunciation, dissipation, and restraint improve inherently. One can also enhance their ethical conduct. Additionally, one can achieve all of their goals by praying to the goddess. Okay, now what I find interesting about that, okay, this is the idea that things that can be achieved through penance, which is, certainly part of this. However, the focus here is on asceticism, which is why I say this is a very highly Vedic and orthodox kind of a story. And as we know, Shiva Shakti are the kind of core, deities that are associated. I mean, there's others too. I mean, related to the Sri Chakra and so forth, but that are associated with Tantra. And Tantra is really the opposite of asceticism. In fact, it's anti-aesthetic. And So to me, there's that curious paradox right there that says, okay, why is Shiva, a god who's associated with Tantra and also with this aspect of, this creation destruction aspect, why is he, why is asceticism the way to Shiva? Okay, why is that the case? And why is that the thing that draws his attention and draws his love? Okay. So I find that paradox rather interesting. And also what's interesting is that asceticism is said to improve your, this petitioning to Ma Brahmacharini is said to improve your ethics. And as I've mentioned, ethical religion tends to focus around asceticism. Like even when we go back to talking about Plato and Platonic ideas about religion, where God is the good and the one and all that kind of stuff. Definitely the ideal life is an ascetic one. It's one where you deny the world and deny yourself. So here's this world denying by going into the forest, going into this chaotic place. It's in many ways, it's very paradoxical, at least to our way of thinking about this. And so this extreme abstinence that she engages in just seems out of line with what I would think of Shaivite, religious practice. Okay, not that there aren't renunciates who are devoted to Shiva. I mean, it's not that isn't a thing. But so but to me, I feel like there's another. I don't feel like it's necessarily as paradoxical as it seems, because Tantra. Now, as we know, Tantra is about, Tantra has a reputation, okay, for being something for this idea of being immersed in the world. I'm going to read a little bit. I mean, I've spoken about Tantra before, but I think this is worth repeating here. It says here, the Tantra does not subject itself to intellectual problems or metaphysical inquiries as do Vedanta and other early traditions of thought in the subcontinent and beyond, perceiving the being and the world as maya or illusion, unreal, a mere shadow of the real, or as things removed from their original identity. Questions as to why or whence are not the areas of tantrika deliberations. On the contrary, Tantra accepts all actions as they are, transmuting them into inner awareness and further into a creative evolution, all desires into the vehicle of transcendence, and all energy into the ultimate means of liberation. Now, it says, Tantra, by believing in the principle enunciated in the Vishvara Tantra, what is here is everywhere, what is not here is nowhere. Okay, aims at the realizing the known and dismisses efforts of running after the unknown. Thus, Tantra is a technique of harvesting inherent energies of body and mind by their acceptance. It is a process of elevating what one is born with. It identifies the being in the being itself, not in its negation or non-acceptance, but rather in its full acceptance. Okay, and that goes back to the story of Tara, where the sage Vasista he is done practicing this asceticism and can't reach enlightenment. And he's told by Brahma that he must pray to goddess Tara. And this is not the Buddhist Tara, just as a reminder. This is the Hindu Tara. And when he starts to worship, try to recite her mantra and practice austerities, practice these tapas, nothing happens. He practices probably as long as Devi Brahmacharini does to try to win Shiva, and nothing happens. So he gets very frustrated and is ready to curse Tara. And then she appears before him and says, look, you don't have any idea what you're doing. If you want to worship me, now, of course, this is where it ties in with Buddhism, but she says, go find this Buddha in the mountains. He knows how to worship me. He'll tell you the way to worship me. So she goes, the sage goes, Sage Vasista goes and finds this Buddha. And to his absolute horror, this Buddha is surrounded by naked women and is intoxicated. And, he's ready to turn his tail and leave. And the Buddha says, no, he says, this is the way. You can't reject things as they are. There has to be an acceptance of things as they are. The world just is. You don't want to question why or, try to find a reason why certain things are the way you like them and the way that they're not. They just are. Okay? Now, if you look back at the story of Brahmacharini, there's a certain acceptance there of a situation. I mean, she is practicing these austerities. She is, she's basically an imitation of Shiva. She's doing what he's doing. She's acting as that reflection. And there you see the idea of life. The actions that we perform, are reflected in our consciousness in some way. Okay, again, if she is really the consciousness of Shiva, or the embodiment there, she is, it's almost like they're reflecting each other. Okay, and so he's in doubt. He's skeptical, right? So, but this abstaining from the pleasures of life. Okay. Now, certainly within Tantra, there are different traditions within Tantra, and I'm talking both Hindu and Buddhist Tantra. But there are some traditions where, what we think of as indulging in the pleasures of the world, including sex and things like that, that's not actually done, that those desires are actually withheld and they're sublimated, because when they're sublimated, that energy can be taken and used for this kind of alchemical process that moves us towards, they're calling it transcendence or enlightenment. But in this case, we're talking about the rising of Kundalini, right? It rises just in the same way that actually practicing yoga prepares the body for that kind of an experience. It's kind of like getting rid of certain influences in the body will also allow that energy to rise. And of course, they talk about Shakti as being at the base of the spine in her first form as Shailputri, right? Now we're talking about her moving more through the sexual and the power center, actually. The sacrum or the Svadhisthana chakra are considered to be the power centers. That's where your quote unquote your gut feelings are. You might think of the solar plexus as being your gut, but that's a little more emotional. This is a little more solidly feminine, solidly intuitive, right? And the Svadhisthana is that power center. So this is kind of like a Kundalini rising. It's like a moving towards Shiva and Shakti meeting. Shiva being at the third eye usually is considered to be where Shiva is, or towards the crown, where the two of them unite up in that part of the spinal column. If we're talking about that as the raising of the energy and the consciousness in the body. So this is that process of Shiva and Shakti meeting, at least at this stage of the Navadurgas and what we're seeing here. So, right. So while Tantra's actual way is not a way of suppression, sometimes suppression can, of those instincts or the withholding, it's just like people who engage in sexual intercourse and don't allow for that release, or they don't, they kind of hold back from the ultimate orgasmic release because that energy ends up being transmuted into something else. That may be at least from a tantric view, that would be, the sense of this story. That would be one of the messages, I would think, of this story. The story itself, though, of course, in the way it's presented usually is in a very orthodox Vedantic kind of way. So, again, like a lot of these myths and stories about these deities, not just in Hinduism, but in other spaces as well, there's sometimes the which we'll call the obvious orthodox, dogmatic, scriptural reason that is given or interpretation of a particular story. For example, with Adam and Eve, that's often interpreted as, well, this shows how women are weak, and through human sin, the world is now imperfect. And, that's supposed to be the message there. I would argue that story actually has more of a meaning having to do with, the way in which we come into the field of time. And, of course, that story still does treat it like somehow it's a mistake or a bad thing to do. But if you think about folklore of the one forbidden thing, maybe there's an inevitability to it. So rather than it being viewed as a sin, it's an inevitability. So similarly with this story, I'm not comparing those two stories in terms of content, but more in terms of the form and the way that it will be read in kind of a social didactic, moralistic context versus how it can be read in a, how it can be read in a, looking a little bit beyond that particular meaning. So for me, the Brahmacharini story, it's that kind of asceticism that one practices to build up that energy, as it were. It's allowing that she's at that second stage, is at that sacral stage. That's like, setting, it's like the pilot light, setting fire to that power center. And she's doing it through the denial of other impulses that might, at least at that initial stage, dissipate some of that energy, potentially. So that's one possible way of looking at it. There may be others with, depending on which tantric tradition you practice, there might be some people who feel differently about that as well. But that, to me, is really what the essence is of this story. And and that purity and that purity of essence. Even, okay, that was the other thing too, the spilling of the water jar. What's the thing? The kamandalu, that's it. Sorry, the word wouldn't come to me. If it's, when that spills and when she washes the demonic away, okay, so here she is at a point when Shiva is finally coming to speak to her. Of course, he's trying to, in disguise, and trying to dissuade her. But this is like at that moment where, where she's in this state and she's being attacked. And, she's being overwhelmed by all of these asuras and all of these influences that want to pull her out of that state, that want to dissipate her energy, really. And that is dissipating the energy of pure consciousness. So it's the way in which perhaps, earthly things, when they're out of balance, in the sense of, too much of something, the way one can fall into addiction, for example, or the way in which one might overindulge to the point that they make themselves sick. They represent that kind of thing, but being washed away by the water, we go back to that kind of flood imaging, and the way in which the flood not only purifies and purges, but also the way in which it regresses. It takes something back to its original form in some way. So as she's, confronting all of these things, it's almost like returning her to a more, that innocence, that innocence that is absent of all of these power plays and these worldly things that are not part of who she is yet, because she's actually coming out of girlhood and into womanhood. So in a way, it's that, like I think of the Kanya Kumari, right? The that form of Durga that's often taken as like a 7 or 8 year old girl, who is, designated the Kanya Kumari, and that's that the power in the young girl. So it almost like is a restoration of that power. And then, of course, but then Parvati uses fire. She opens her eyes, and then she's able to reduce them to ashes. So she has that destructive aspect in her as well. Just by her opening her eyes. And it's interesting because it's almost literally the same power that Shiva had when confronted with Kama. I mean, he opens his third eye. She just opens her eyes, and the same thing happens. What's in front of her, the desire in front of her, the desire that's represented by those figures, whether they're trying to impose themselves. They're both trying to impose themselves on the god in their own way, and they're both reduced to ashes. Okay, so in the face of that fire, that it's basically burned up and transmuted into some other kind of substance. Okay, there's something kind of alchemical about that symbolism. So that's about all I'm going to say about Brahmacharini, because like I said, I don't want to wax too long in directions that may be too divergent from the topic. I want to thank everybody again for listening. You can check out all my work at Chthonia.net. I've got some updating to do. The podcast gets updated there every week. Obviously, it's hosted on Spreaker, but you can get this, if you're listening to this, you've gotten it probably through your own podcast app, or you might be watching it on YouTube at the Chthonia channel. where I usually create some video version to put up of these podcasts. And I'm also on social media, Chthonia Podcast, one word on Twitter and IG, 2 words on Facebook. And if anybody's interested in supporting my work and would like to become a patron, please check out patreon.com/Chthonia, and you can consider becoming a patron there. I try to put up extra episodes every month. At the moment, I've had, a rather tumultuous last few weeks for a number of reasons. So and now I'm off to London actually in a couple of days. So apologies for not doing more for people who are on Patreon this particular month, but this will get better once a lot of these, some of these obligations and these rather unexpected obstacles are able to get out of, I'm able to clear them. So thank you again for listening. Thank you again to all of my patrons for your support. It's very much appreciated. And I'll see you in the next episode.